In 1972, a film set in Rome went silent. Chuck Norris, world karate champion, undefeated in competition, stood across from Bruce Lee in the Colosseum. The cameras weren't rolling yet. What happened in those minutes before the director called action was never officially recorded. But the crew remembered. They remembered how Norris asked to spar, how Lee agreed without hesitation, how it ended before most of them understood it had begun. What changed that day wasn't captured on film. It was captured in the way Norris moved for the rest of the shoot, in the questions he stopped asking, in the silence that replaced certainty. This is what they saw. The production crew arrived at Cinecit Studios outside Rome in early spring. The air still carried the coolness of winter mornings, and the reconstructed Colosseum set stood empty under scaffolding and lights that hadn't yet been turned on. Chuck Norris came with credentials that needed no introduction. 6-time undefeated world middleweight karate champion, a man who had built a successful chain of schools across America. His students included Steve McQueen. He moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had tested his abilities in competition and never found them lacking. He had been personally requested for this film. Not as an actor, he had no illusions about that, but as the physical embodiment of a credible threat. The role required someone who could stand across from Bruce Lee and make the audience believe the fight could go either way. When Norris walked the set that first morning, he studied the space with a competitor's eye, measured distances, noted the surface beneath his feet. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for tournaments, structured training, specific techniques, controlled execution. Bruce Lee arrived differently. He came alone, before most of the crew. Those who saw him later remembered that he didn't walk the set the way Norris had. He stood in the center of it and was still, not stretching, not rehearsing, just observing, the way water observes the shape of whatever contains it. Lee had been fighting for this film to exist for years. Not just fighting to make it, but fighting for the right to make it his way. Hollywood had wanted him in supporting roles, playing stereotypes, delivering broken English and exotic mysticism. He had refused, walked away from offers that would have made him wealthy, returned to Hong Kong and became the biggest star in Asian cinema. Now he was back, but on his terms. This film, The Way of the Dragon, was his script, his choreography, his vision of what martial arts could be on screen if freed from the wires and the opera conventions. The crew understood they were watching something rare. Two men at the peak of their abilities. One who had proven himself in every major tournament that mattered. Another who had walked away from the tournament system entirely, calling it limiting, unrealistic, incomplete. They had different languages for combat. Norris spoke in the vocabulary of competition, points divisions, rules that ensured safety and fairness. Lee spoke in the vocabulary of adaptation, formlessness, directness, the economy of motion that exists when there are no rules to shelter behind. When they met that first day, the greeting was respectful, professional. Norris extended his hand with the courtesy of one champion to another. Lee accepted it with the simplicity of someone who didn't think in terms of champions. The Italian director watched them together and felt something he couldn't articulate. A tension that wasn't hostile, an anticipation that wasn't about the cameras. The crew began setting up lights, testing angles, marking positions on the ancient stone floor of the replica Colosseum. The film they were about to make would be choreographed, rehearsed, safe. But before any of that, there would need to be an understanding between these two men, not an understanding reached through words or contracts or directorial instruction. A different kind of understanding entirely. The morning light came through the arches. The set was nearly ready, and in the hours before the cameras would roll, something would happen that no script had planned for. The first rehearsal was scheduled for mid-morning. Technical blocking, where to stand, which angles favored the camera, how the choreography would unfold in segments that could be edited together later. But rehearsal requires preparation, and preparation creates gaps in the schedule. Moments when actors wait while lighting is adjusted, while cameras are repositioned, while directors confer with cinematographers about shadows and sight lines. Chuck Norris used these gaps the way he always had. Stretching, reviewing technique in his mind, staying loose and ready. He had performed demonstrations countless times, controlled exhibitions of speed and precision that left audiences impressed. This would be similar. Choreography instead of competition, but the same fundamental requirement: make it look real without anyone getting hurt. Bruce Lee used the gaps differently. He sat on the edge of the replica Colosseum wall, watching the crew work, occasionally standing to test a movement in the space, feeling how his weight transferred on this particular surface, how sound carried in this particular architecture. The assistant director called for a 15-minute break. Equipment needed to be moved. There was time to kill. Norris approached Lee with a suggestion framed as professional courtesy. He had heard about Lee's training methods. The philosophical approach, the famous one, inch punch the intercepting fist, concepts that sounded interesting but remained abstract without demonstration. Would Lee be willing to exchange some techniques, show him what this Jeet Kune do actually looked like in application? Lee looked at him for a moment, just observing. "You want to spar?" Lee said. Not a question, a clarification. Norris smiled. "If you have time, light contact, just to understand each other's rhythm before we film." It was a reasonable request. Professionals testing compatibility, actors establishing timing. In tournament circles, this kind of controlled sparring was common, a way to calibrate without competing, to practice without ego. Lee stood without answering directly, moved to the center of the set. The crew, sensing something, began to gather at a respectful distance, not crowding, just positioning themselves where they could see. The Italian director started to speak, something about insurance, about liability, but his translator stopped him. There was a quality to the silence that made interruption feel wrong. Norris stepped into the space. He dropped into his stance, the traditional carrot positioning that had carried him through dozens of tournament victories. Weight distributed, hands ready, body aligned for the explosive techniques that judges rewarded with points. Lee stood in something that barely qualified as a stance at all, hands loose, weight centered but not committed. He looked almost casual, the way someone stands when waiting for a bus. "Whenever you're ready," Lee said. Norris nodded. This was familiar territory. He had sparred with masters from multiple styles, had tested himself against judoka, kung fu practitioners, boxers. He understood the language of controlled contact, the silent agreement to demonstrate skill without damage. He stepped forward with a clean reverse punch, tournament speed, tournament precision, the kind of technique that had scored points in Madison Square Garden. Lee wasn't there, not blocking, not deflecting, just absent from the space the punch occupied. Norris reset, tried a different approach, a roundhouse kick with enough control to stop short but enough commitment to be real. Lee moved again. Differently, a shift that seemed minimal but changed everything. And then Lee touched him. The touch wasn't a strike, not in any way that tournaments would recognize or judges would score. Lee's hand met Norris's shoulder as the kick extended, a placement so light it might have been accidental, but Norris's balance shifted. His kick, perfectly executed, lost its endpoint. He recovered immediately, the way champions do, and reset. Lee had already moved back to center, still loose, still waiting. Norris adjusted his approach. He had faced unorthodox fighters before, practitioners who didn't follow conventional patterns. The answer was fundamentals, clean technique, disciplined structure, the basics that never failed under pressure. He feinted high and came in low, a combination that had worked in competition countless times. The feint to draw the block, the real attack to the opening created. Lee didn't block the feint, didn't react to it at all. He responded to the real attack before Norris fully committed to it. A hand appeared, not fast in the way tournament fighters are fast, but present in a way that suggested it had been waiting there all along. It touched Norris's extended arm, guided it past its intended target, used its own momentum to extend it further than Norris had planned. Norris was reaching when he should have been retracting, off balance when he should have been grounded. Lee's other hand tapped his ribs, gently, the way you might tap someone to get their attention. The crew watched in silence. This didn't look like the sparring they had seen in dojos or demonstrations. There was no clash, no testing of strength, no exchange of blocked attacks and counter strikes. It looked like Lee was having a conversation and Norris was speaking a language Lee understood but didn't need to use. Norris stepped back, breathed. He had tournament experience that Lee lacked, years of controlled competition, judges, rules, point systems. That experience told him to adapt, change timing, vary rhythm, break the pattern. He came in faster, used angles, committed to techniques that would force Lee to respond conventionally, to block or evade in ways that would create predictable openings. But Lee didn't respond conventionally. Every attack Norris launched seemed to arrive at a space Lee had already left. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical evasions that looked impressive on film. Just economically, a weight shift, a rotation measured in degrees rather than feet, and each time Norris extended, Lee was there at the extension, touching, not hitting, making contact with a precision that felt surgical. Ribs, shoulder, jaw, center line. Each touch could have been a strike. Each placement showed an opening Norris hadn't known he was creating. There was no speed that Norris could clock, no technique he could isolate and counter. Lee seemed to be responding to intention rather than action, reading the decision to punch before the punch launched, occupying the space that Norris's kick would travel through before the kick began its arc. It felt less like fighting and more like physics, like attempting to strike water and finding it had already flowed elsewhere. Norris stopped, not from exhaustion, not from frustration, from recognition. He had entered this exchange believing in the fundamental language of combat, attack and defense, timing and distance, technique and counter-technique. But Lee was demonstrating a different grammar entirely, one where those categories didn't exist as separate things. Lee lowered his hands, stepped back. The stillness between them carried more weight than any strike had. Norris bowed, a small formal gesture that carried multiple meanings: respect, acknowledgement, the martial tradition of honoring what had just transpired between them. Lee returned the bow, then extended his hand. They shook, briefly, and it was over. The crew didn't applaud. A few of them exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath without realizing it. The assistant director checked his watch and called out something about resuming the lighting setup. People returned to their tasks with an unusual quietness. Norris walked to the edge of the set where his bag waited. He took a long drink of water. One of the Italian crew members approached him, started to say something in broken English about what he had just witnessed. Norris smiled, nodded politely, and moved away before the conversation could develop. Lee sat back down on the Colosseum wall, watching the crew work, as if nothing had happened, as if the previous 5 minutes were just another technical break in a long day of filming. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the production. During the remainder of that first day, Norris asked fewer questions. When the choreography was explained, he listened differently. Before, he had engaged as a peer, offering suggestions based on his tournament experience, discussing what would look most impressive on camera. Now he simply absorbed what Lee demonstrated and replicated it, not with the stiffness of someone following orders, with the attention of someone who had discovered his map of the territory was incomplete. The other crew members noticed. The stunt coordinator, who had worked on a dozen martial arts films, remarked to the director that Norris moved through the rehearsals with unusual precision. Not the precision of technique, he had always had that, but the precision of someone who was no longer performing what he knew. He was learning what he didn't. Lee, for his part, treated Norris exactly as he had before, explained the choreography patiently, demonstrated angles, made adjustments to ensure Norris would look formidable on camera. There was no trace of Victor in his manner, no subtle superiority. He worked with Norris the way a good teacher works with a serious student, with attention to detail and an assumption of capability. During lunch, some of the crew sat together in the shade of the reconstructed arches. They spoke in Italian, unaware that one of the translators was listening. They debated what they had seen, whether it had been real or some kind of demonstration, whether Norris had held back out of caution or whether he had actually been trying. The translator, who said nothing, understood what they didn't. Both men had been trying. But they had been trying to accomplish different things. Norris had been trying to apply his considerable skill within the framework he knew. Lee had been demonstrating that the framework itself was optional. That evening, after the day's shooting wrapped, Norris stayed late, not practicing, just sitting in the Colosseum set as the sun lowered and the Roman light turned golden. He sat in the same spot where Lee had sat that morning. A crew member, leaving for the day, saw him there and almost asked if he was all right, but something about the quality of Norris's stillness suggested this was a private moment. A recalibration happening in silence. The next morning, Norris arrived early, so did Lee. They nodded to each other across the empty set. And when filming began, something new existed between them. The fight scene they filmed over the following days became something the script hadn't anticipated. On paper, it was written as a climactic confrontation, two warriors meeting in the ancient Colosseum, techniques clashing, a dramatic escalation building to Lee's inevitable victory. Standard martial arts cinema, choreographed spectacle. But what appeared on film carried a different quality. Norris fought with everything the script required. His kicks were sharp, his punches committed, his movements demonstrating exactly why he had been cast. He looked dangerous, capable. A legitimate threat that the audience could believe might actually defeat the protagonist. Yet beneath the choreography, something else registered on camera, a subtle deference that wasn't in the blocking. The way Norris's character seemed to recognize, not immediately, but gradually, that he was facing something beyond his experience. It showed in micro-expressions the camera, caught between the rehearsed strikes, a flicker of reassessment. A moment of adjustment that wasn't about the next choreographed move, but about understanding what kind of fight this actually was. Lee directed these moments with specific attention. He would stop filming and speak quietly to Norris about intention. Not about where to place a kick or how to sell a punch, but about what the character was experiencing, what it felt like to encounter someone who moved outside the rules you had mastered. Norris understood these directions in a way he couldn't have a week earlier. The stunt coordinator watched the dailies with the director and noticed something unexpected. The fight looked more realistic than fights with better trained stunt performers. Not because the techniques were sloppier or the contact heavier, because the psychological progression felt authentic. "He's not acting afraid," the coordinator said in Italian, gesturing at the screen where Norris defended against Lee's assault. "He's acting like someone whose understanding is changing." The director nodded. He had seen something similar in documentaries. The moment when an expert realizes their expertise has limits. It couldn't be performed, only experienced and then remembered. Between takes, Lee and Norris spoke briefly. Not about the film, about structure and formlessness, about how tournament rules created both safety and limitation, about what happened when you trained only against people who followed the same rules you did. These weren't lectures. Lee offered observations. Norris asked occasional questions. The conversations lasted minutes, not hours. But they accumulated. One afternoon, during a break, Norris demonstrated a technique from his competition days, a spinning back kick that had won him multiple championships. Clean, powerful, textbook execution. Lee watched, then showed him the same kick with a single modification, a minor shift in weight distribution that sacrificed nothing in power, but gained significant reduction in telegraph. The difference was so subtle the camera probably wouldn't catch it. Norris tried it, felt the change, nodded slowly. "You don't compete anymore," Norris said, not a question, an observation. "Competition has rules," Lee replied. "Reality doesn't." It was the closest either of them came to discussing what had happened that first morning. The final shot of their fight scene, wrapped on a Thursday evening. The Italian crew applauded, standard practice when a major sequence completed. Norris and Lee shook hands, the same professional courtesy they had shown at the beginning. But the handshake lasted a moment longer, and in that moment, the entire production understood they had witnessed something that transcended the film they were making. something that would outlast it. The film premiered in Hong Kong in 1972. It broke box office records. The fight in the Colosseum became iconic, studied by martial artists, analyzed by film students, replicated in countless homages. Bruce Lee died the following year. Suddenly, impossibly, at 32, the world mourned a star. The martial arts community mourned something else, the loss of someone who had been pushing the boundaries of what combat training could become. His notes and writings would be published later. His methods would be codified by students. But the living evolution of his approach ended in July 1973. Chuck Norris continued, built an acting career that spanned decades, became a cultural icon in his own right, starred in films and television series that made him a household name. His tournament record remained undefeated. His schools continued to produce champions. But in interviews, when asked about Bruce Lee, Norris spoke with a precision that didn't match his usual casual manner. He never claimed they were equals, never suggested the sparring session had been competitive, never framed it as a fight he might have won on a different day. Instead, he said things like, "Bruce showed me something I hadn't seen before," or "That day changed how I understood martial arts." Once, in an interview decades later, a journalist pushed him, asked directly who would have won in a real fight. Norris paused for a long time before answering. Bruce wasn't interested in winning fights, he finally said. He was interested in understanding combat at a level most of us never reach. The journalist pressed, wanted a clearer answer, a definitive statement. Norris smiled, the patient smile of someone who had spent years trying to articulate an experience that resisted language. "If you had asked me before that day in Rome, I would have given you a confident answer. After that day, I understood the question was wrong." Other martial artists who heard the story, the semi-legendary account of what happened before the cameras rolled, understood what Norris meant. Some rejected it, insisted tournament success was the only objective measure. Others sought out Lee's students, trying to learn what had made him different. The Jeet Kune Do lineage fractured into competing schools. Some tried to preserve Lee's techniques exactly as he had taught them. Others argued he would have wanted the art to keep evolving. The arguments continue, but the core lesson remained consistent across the divisions. Mastery isn't about perfect technique, it's about perfect adaptation. It isn't about being faster or stronger. It's about being present completely, precisely, in each moment of contact. It isn't about winning. It's about understanding at a depth that makes winning irrelevant. Norris never claimed to have reached that understanding, but he acknowledged having seen it, having stood in front of it, having measured himself against it and recognized the measurement itself was limited. In his later years, he spoke less about his tournament victories, more about the teachers who had shown him what he didn't know. Lee was always first on that list. The sparring session that morning in Rome was never filmed. No footage exists. No official record confirms exactly what happened, but the crew members who witnessed it carried the memory, told their version to other film professionals. The story spread, changed, acquired mythical details that may or may not have been accurate. What remained consistent across every version: something happened that day that couldn't be faked for cameras. Something real, something that transformed a scheduled film shoot into an education. The Colosseum set was eventually dismantled. The film became a classic, the legend grew, and in quiet dojos around the world, serious practitioners still ask the same question Chuck Norris learned to ask in Rome. Not "how do I win?" but "what am I missing?"